morning and welcome to the 18th Annual Center for American Studies Conference on America's Founding Principles and History. I'm Elizabeth Coffer-Bush, co-director of the center, and our theme this year focuses on civil disobedience and civil discourse, something that I think everyone in our country could learn a lot about. I'm very happy right now to introduce a good friend of mine. His name is Dr. Adam Seagrave. He's an associate professor at Arizona State University School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, which is a mouthful. He's actually been one of the founding faculty there and has been instrumental in building their programs. And I should also say that the program they have at ASU has become a model for the country, that there are a number of flagship universities trying to emulate what they've been able to do there. Adam specializes in political philosophy and American political thought. He earned his BA from St. Thomas Aquinas College and his PhD from Notre Dame in political theory. He's authored a number of works such as The Foundations of Natural Morality and Liberty and Equality, The American Conversation, and he's co-founder of the Race and the American Story Project, and I believe that's where his latest book grew out of. He's deeply involved in K-12 civics education and serves as a senior fellow for education with the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, that's FAIR. His work focuses on the intersection of classical liberal principles, race, and civic education. And I'm happy to say we have some copies of his book, which I'm sure he'll talk about his co-author a little bit in his talk. I use this book in my class, and his talk is going to be inspired by things he wrote in this book. So if anyone wants to get a signature, get a book after the session or during all day, you can come by and grab one. So please join me in welcoming my friend, Dr. Adam Seagrave.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the Center for hosting this great event. Thank you to all of you for being here. My talk is going to be about freedom and Martin Luther King, particularly freedom in his thought and in his life's work. So freedom, or liberty, as it used to be more frequently called, is one of those concepts whose importance and popularity through history has virtually precluded us from adequately understanding its meaning. Because everyone knows that freedom is good, very few non-academics, call them normal people, in American history have devoted any thought to considering what freedom is beyond its basic definition involving the absence of restraint. It is only in this most basic form that freedom appears in recent American political discourse, as in the freedom to choose, the freedom of the market, freedom of religion, or freedom of speech. As these expressions illustrate, we don't usually allow freedom to go out by itself. It needs to be chaperoned by an of, to, from, or for. Because freedom is usually defined as the absence of restraint in negative terms, we feel the need to attach it to something that actually has a positive existence in order to give it a clear meaning. The case is otherwise with the concept of equality. Although it is similarly unexamined due to its long-standing acceptance in American political culture as an undeniable good, we allow equality to go out alone all the time. Equality doesn't need to be equality of, equality to, or equality for. Equality, plain and simple, all by itself, places demands on our political morality and on public policy. All men are created equal is, after all, self-evident. In treating freedom and equality this way, though, we reverse the understanding of the American founding generation. They more often treated freedom or liberty as the primary standalone concept, and equality as a tag-along descriptor for how freedom applied to human beings. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, for example, stated that all men are by nature equally free and independent. All men are free is the statement that's being made here. In what ways are they free? By nature and equally. The The sermons, newspapers, public documents, and letters of the Revolutionary and founding periods mentioned freedom or liberty about 4 times more often than equality. Equality is certainly an important moral and political concept, and it's important primarily when and because it means equality in basic human freedom. Martin Luther King Jr. agreed with the Revolutionary and founding generations on the paramount importance of freedom. Freedom formed, in fact, a focus or fulcrum of his philosophy, a central point about which much of his thought turned. King explicitly talks about freedom often, and even more often it forms an implicit but foundational conceptual support for his distinctive approach to achieving equal civil rights. In his 1957 speech on the Montgomery bus boycott, in his letter from Birmingham jail, and in his I Have a Dream speech, King describes his method of nonviolent resistance in terms of a philosophy of freedom that emphasizes its spiritual or metaphysical nature. King's method is opposed to violence, which he understands as the use of physical force in violation of the natural moving principles of a human being. This is a crucial connecting thread of King's thought that runs much deeper than the strategic consequentialism or feel-good rhetoric that most students and many commentators associate with King. It also helps us to understand how King's thought and rhetoric are a kind of culmination of the American political tradition, highlighting especially the role of historical slavery and the contributions of African Americans to this tradition. It may not be terribly controversial to affirm the preeminent importance of freedom as an American political principle, though freedom has at times acquired more political connotations in recent years. But it is important to understand the meaning of freedom in this American political context and to appreciate the ways in which our national struggle with slavery, including especially the articulations of this struggle by African American thinkers such as King himself, has given shape and weight to the idea of freedom in the United States. Despite its singular status in the American memory, the Declaration of Independence was in fact only one of a great many similar statements of rights that multiplied like unalienable rabbits in the Revolutionary era. The Stamp Act debates of the mid-1760s had produced dozens of declarations of rights, both from individual American colonies and from an intercolonial Congress. And this tradition of declaring rights continued in the intervening decade before 1776. And then beginning earlier in 1776 and continuing for the next 6 or 7 years, each of the now states adopted new constitutions, and almost all of these contained their own versions of declarations of rights. We have, in other words, dozens of different versions of rights declarations that sprang from the American colonies/states in the 1760s and 1770s, all of which possess some degree of overlap with each other. All of these declarations emphasize the closely related concepts of freedom, liberty, and natural rights, and many of them included statements relating to equality as well. The particular phrase, all men are created equal, does not, to my knowledge, appear in any of the other declarations. There are very few, if any, other instances in all of these other declarations where equality appears by itself, unattached to freedom. In Jefferson's rough draft of the Declaration of Independence, equal is paired with independent. All men are created equal and independent, those are the words he uses. This is closer to George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, with its phrasing of equally free and independent, but with the word free removed, perhaps due to its partial synonymity with independent. Then in the editing process in Congress, the word independent was also removed from the original Virginia Declaration formulation, leaving only equal. Moving from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was written just a month or so before the Declaration of Independence and would have been in Jefferson's mind when he wrote his draft, to the final version of the Declaration of Independence, we go from equally free and independent to equal and independent, and then to equal. So why is this significant? I would argue that the removal of the word independent, a more specific synonym of freedom, from the Declaration's most well-known statement of political principle was connected to the removal of the paragraph condemning the transatlantic slave trade in Jefferson's draft, and that it has taken the efforts of African Americans, with assistance from non-African Americans, to restore freedom to its rightful place in our political consciousness in the time since. This might seem like a strange thing to argue for at least a couple of reasons. First, the word rights appears in the clause immediately following all men are created equal, and then the word liberty appears in the clause right after that. The Declaration does, in fact, prominently include the concept of freedom via these synonymous terms. It remains significant, though, that these terms are placed at some distance from the ringing opening words of the first self-evident truth. All men are created equal has held a pride of place in the American public consciousness throughout our history relative to any of the truths that follow, relegating the remaining ones to secondary or derivative status. All men are created equal is most often quoted in isolation from the statements about rights that follow, as a kind of shorthand for the entire paragraph. Rights, liberty, or freedom have therefore received less emphasis and attention from most Americans since. They are perceived to be elaborations upon or specifications of the primary statement of equality. Secondly, the Declaration of Independence as it stands has in fact been used throughout American history to argue first for the abolition of slavery and then for equal civil rights. So it seems the Declaration's statement of equality has by itself accomplished the same effects for the cause of freedom that a statement about freedom would have. This sounds plausible from our perspective, 150 years removed from the 13th Amendment and 60 years removed from the Civil Rights era. To us, the fact that nearly a century passed between the Declaration of Independence and the 13th Amendment seems relatively insignificant. Because of the prominence of the Declaration of Independence in Abraham Lincoln's statesmanship, moreover, the distance between the Declaration and the abolition of slavery seems to shrink and perhaps even disappear altogether. The Declaration of Independence affirmed human equality, and then Abraham Lincoln applied it in emancipating the enslaved. I would nevertheless suggest that the removal of free and independent from the Declaration's leading self-evident truth was connected with and reinforced the purpose of Congress's removal of the slavery paragraph from Jefferson's draft. According to Jefferson's later account, it was the delegates from South Carolina and Georgia who insisted upon the removal of that slavery paragraph from his draft. This removal made the anti-slavery thrust of the Declaration's philosophy implicit rather than explicit, no less clear, but less direct and obvious. The same thing happened with the removal of free and independent from the Declaration's statement about equality. It allowed the anti-slavery implications of the Declaration's philosophy to stop short of the direct and obvious contradiction that would have been introduced by the word freedom or its synonyms. Slaveholders though they were, the Virginia anti-slavery group, including people like Jefferson, Madison, Mason, and Washington, were much more comfortable with obvious anti-slavery language than their fellow delegates from South Carolina or Georgia were. Although later generations of Southern slaveholders, such as John C. Calhoun, would express vehement disagreement with the Declaration's statement that all men are created equal, it is quite possible that earlier generations of slaveholders in Congress were more comfortable with equal than they were with free or independent. Because of these congressional removals, it was left to an African American named Prince Hall, who was mentioned in the earlier talk, to elaborate the Declaration's philosophy of freedom in a 1777 petition to the Massachusetts legislature. Hall argued that enslaved African Americans had, quote, in common with all other men, a natural and inalienable right to that freedom which the great parent of the universe hath bestowed equally on all mankind, end quote. The language Hall uses here beautifully ties together Mason's statement in the Virginia Declaration of Rights that all men are by nature equally free and independent, with the Continental Congress's statement in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. In Hall's formulation, which is superior in my view to either of the others, all men, which is further specified as all mankind, have been equally given, both by nature and inalienably, and by the Creator or parent of the universe, a right to freedom. Hall restates this point later in summarizing his petition that enslaved African Americans be, quote, restored to the enjoyment of that freedom which is the natural right of all men, end quote. In distinguishing between the possession of the natural right to freedom on the one hand and the actual enjoyment or exercise of that right on the other, Hall offers a clearer statement of natural rights than that offered in the Declaration of Independence itself. In the Declaration, the absence of a similar distinction invites confusion regarding whether people who are prevented from enjoying or exercising a natural right nevertheless possess that right. For example, whether the language of the Declaration includes enslaved people who were prevented from exercising their inalienable right to liberty. If Prince Hall's language were in the Declaration, the deep confusion regarding this question, which has prevailed in American political discourse for generations, and the countless hours that have been spent in classrooms such as my own trying to sort this out, would have been avoided. Hall's emphasis on freedom carries through the long tradition of African American poetry as well. Phyllis Wheatley, in her poem dedicated to the Earl of Dartmouth in 1772, just a few years prior to the Declaration and Hall's petition, opens by exclaiming, quote, hail happy day when smiling like the morn, fair freedom rose New England to adorn, end quote. Later in the poem, Wheatley dedicates a stanza to explaining how her love of freedom sprung from her experience of being kidnapped from her home in Africa and separated from her family. 86 years later, in 1858, Frances Harper published a poem titled Bury Me in a Free Land, which closes with the memorable lines, quote, all that my yearning spirit craves is bury me not in a land of slaves, end quote. These two African-American poets are representative of an extensive and rich tradition of African-American literature that highlights the concept of freedom in direct connection with the experience of enslavement. One of the most well-known examples of this literature is in the writings of Frederick Douglass. In chapter 17 of his second autobiography, significantly titled My Bondage and My Freedom, Douglass relates his battle with Mr. Covey, an overseer who is known for using cruel and violent tactics to enforce the submission of enslaved people. This battle with Covey is highly significant for Douglass because, as he says, it inspired him with a renewed determination to be a freeman. Douglass became more self-conscious of his natural right to freedom through exercising freedom in resistance. He concludes the chapter with a quotation from Lord Byron, which he thinks sums up the moral of the story accurately. Quote, hereditary bondmen, know ye not, who would be free themselves must strike the blow, end quote. The goal of resistance for an enslaved person such as Douglass himself is to become free, to secure the enjoyment, as Prince Hall puts it, of the natural right to freedom. It's not that Douglass doesn't want equality with Covey, but what he really wants, what he strives towards, thinks about, and writes about, is freedom. I could use the rest of my time here and all of lunch multiplying examples of the prominence of freedom in African-American thought from the Revolutionary era up to the Civil Rights Movement. But if you all will just trust me on that, I'd like to fast forward to Martin Luther King, Jr. In his 1957 speech at the University of California at Berkeley, in which he gave one of his fullest elaborations of the reasoning behind the method of nonviolent resistance that had recently and successfully been utilized in the Montgomery bus boycott, King described the ultimate goal of his social action in the very last line as, quote, "the glittering daybreak of freedom and justice," end quote. Although freedom makes this climactic appearance at the end, the fundamental premise of the speech is the distinction between the spiritual and the physical, and the superiority of the spiritual force of love to the physical force of violence. King explains that the philosophy undergirding the practical method of nonviolent resistance is a metaphysical one in the sense of being concerned with what's beyond or above the physical world. Freedom is a cornerstone concept in King's metaphysical philosophy and the most important political one. In King's thought, freedom is more than the absence of restraint. It is the positive ability to act in accordance with the moving principles of our human nature. These principles are spiritual or metaphysical: thought, self-awareness, deliberation, reflection, choice. It is with these internal activities that specifically human actions begin. Human actions are different from animal actions, which begin in the more physical principles of sensation: seeing, hearing, smelling, etc. And both of these are distinguished from the purely physical principles of motion like those described by Isaac Newton: inertia and force. Human beings are free insofar as they have the ability to act in human ways through the spiritual and metaphysical principles of action we uniquely possess. Human beings can move the way rocks can, by falling in response to gravitational force, but this isn't a human way of moving because it is not specific to our nature. Human beings have legs just like many other animals, and we can move by walking or running, but this also isn't a human way of moving because it is also not specific to us. What human beings have that moves us in ways only we can move is our reason or intellect, including our self-consciousness. Human freedom, then, is the ability to move according to self-conscious or self-aware reason. The clearest deprivation of freedom occurs when a human being is made subject to solely physical principles of motion. That is, when a person is subject to force contrary to or apart from their rational desire or will. When force is applied to someone in this way, we call it violence, because it is a violation of our natural principles of motion. King advocated nonviolence not only for strategic, practical reasons relating to the sympathy that it would engender in observers. He advocated nonviolence also because it allowed him and his followers to make their protests themselves an exercise in freedom. This is something we often miss in our retrospective appraisals of King's approach. With the benefit of hindsight, we see the effects that King's nonviolent method had on public perceptions of the civil rights movement, and we assume that this was why he chose to protest in that way. It certainly was part of it. King did anticipate some of these effects from his knowledge of Gandhi's method and his impact in India, so this hindsight-assisted assumption is not entirely incorrect. But in speaking and writing about his philosophy of nonviolence, King's arguments are focused not on the consequentialist benefits of nonviolence, its effects on observers, but rather on its intrinsic benefits and righteousness. Nonviolence is the way that allows protesters to live and move in the spiritual realm of human freedom, to assert and manifest their humanity while pressuring their society to recognize this humanity in its laws. As King admitted in the opening of his 1957 speech, there was something complex and even counterintuitive about this reasoning. It wasn't easy to convince the participants in these nonviolent protests that they were really exercising their freedom most effectively by refraining from physically responding to attacks. King and his collaborators required movement members to expressly commit to this nonviolent philosophy, even composing a list of 10 commandments that participants had to sign. These 10 commandments included 2 that foregrounded the idea of freedom. Commandment 4 committed participants to, quote, pray daily to be used by God in order that all men might be free, end quote. And Commandment 5 committed them to, quote, sacrifice personal wishes in order that all men might be free, end quote. This phrasing, that all men might be free, is intriguingly similar to the Declaration of Independence in its reference to all men, simply replacing equal with free. King's civil rights movement was about freedom both in its method and in its primary goal. The preeminence of freedom as the intrinsic animating principle of King's nonviolent movement is clear from his letter from a Birmingham jail, which contains the most extended statement of this philosophy. The letter refers to freedom frequently throughout, describing the civil rights movement in one place as the freedom movement, and explaining the righteousness of resistance in terms of classic natural law philosophy. Socrates, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Martin Buber, Paul Tillich, and even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, extra credit if you know who those guys are the key inspirations for King in the letter. Along with all of these figures, King justifies nonviolent resistance to law, civil disobedience, not on the basis of its practical consequences, but in terms of its intrinsic righteousness. King doesn't even mention the goal of changing bad laws. The point lies rather in acting according to the truth that, quote, an unjust law is no law at all, end quote, and in expressing the highest respect for law by drawing attention to the existence of unjust enactments masquerading as laws. The ultimate goal of civil disobedience, insofar as King expresses one in the letter, is not sympathy or equality or even justice. Towards the end of the speech, King expresses his optimism that, quote, we will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation because the goal of America is freedom, end quote. The idea of a moral law that establishes the dividing line between just and unjust human enactments is itself synonymous with the idea of freedom. According to King's restatement of St. Thomas Aquinas, the moral law designates as unjust any law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. And according to Aquinas, the eternal law is the idea of the governance of things in the mind of God, while the natural law is the rational creature's participation in the eternal law. So how rational human beings understand how God has made the universe. The moral law dictates human action in accordance with reason, which is the moving principle specific to our human nature. Acting in line with the moral law means acting as a free human being. King's moral law is, in other words, simply the divine command relating to human freedom. In his most famous speech, known by its recurring line, I have a dream, King begins by referencing the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and decrying the fact that, quote, 100 years later, the Negro is still is not free, end quote. He compares the Declaration and Constitution jointly to a promissory note or check consisting in, quote, the promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, end quote. King interestingly skips over the line about equality in the Declaration entirely. Instead of saying all men are created equal, as the Declaration says, King goes straight to the next self-evident truth in the Declaration, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. He does this not because he doesn't believe in equality, but because he realizes that the American founding wasn't primarily or fundamentally about equality, it was about freedom and equality in freedom. This priority carries through the rest of the speech. Equality is mentioned twice, once in conjunction with freedom, the invigorating autumn of freedom and equality, that's a quotation, and once in quoting the Declaration of Independence. The substance and climax of the speech revolve rather around freedom, which is mentioned 23 times by my count. Let freedom ring is the call to action King associates with his dream, and the goal of this action is an end state in which everyone is, quote, free at last. As in the case of his nonviolent protests, we tend to interpret King's dream only in terms of its ultimate practical goals or consequences. We tend to think of it only as an ideal state to be approached or approximated in future practical reality. For King, though, there is a significance to the dream that is not only futuristic, but also actually present. King's dream is certainly about what will happen one day in the future, but the dreaming itself is something that happens in the present. The dream's content, that the United States will live up to its creed, that King's children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, is something that might become a concrete reality in the future. The activity of dreaming itself, on the other hand, the fact that King has a dream at all, is something that is happening in the spiritual present. King's dream is both about freedom and is itself an expression of freedom. Despite the fact that his concrete practical reality as a Black American is significantly affected by force and violence, King exercises human freedom by extending himself beyond the physical world to the spiritual or metaphysical. Dreaming is an exercise of spiritual force, just like nonviolent resistance, and similarly constitutes an assertion of human freedom in the face of its opposite. In the last speech of his life, delivered on April 3rd, 1968, the night before he was killed, King returns to the idea of freedom in its opposition to physical force and violence, depicting the confrontation between Police Commissioner Bull Connor and King's protesters in terms of this dichotomy. In King's terms, Bull Connor, quote, knew a kind of physics that somehow didn't relate to the trans physics we knew about, end quote. King goes on to explain how these different planes of knowledge interacted with each other during the Birmingham protests. Quote, and we just went on before the dogs, and we would look at them. And we'd go on before the water hoses, and we would look at them. And we'd just go on singing. Over my head, I see freedom in the air, end quote. The dogs and fire hoses are physical forces that represent a world of violence and unfreedom, a world where Black Americans are treated not as human beings, with spiritual principles of motion like deliberation and choice, but as merely physical beings with merely physical principles of motion. In response to physical violence, King and his followers move themselves beyond the physical world to a spiritual reality that exists over their heads and in the air, a reality that accords with the spiritual or metaphysical nature of their freedom as human beings. King is often admired for the way in which he rhetorically weaved together American founding principles and Christianity in order to persuade a majority of Americans to support the civil rights cause. He is known for his ability to work with existing materials in American political culture and to package them in ways that achieved important public policy results. King isn't often given credit for contributing to American political thought in new ways, ways that advance our understanding of American political principles. As I hope to have plausibly suggested, however, King did in fact contribute significantly to our understanding of American political principles, and he did this particularly in two ways. First, King reapplied American founding era political thought in a way that emphasized freedom as the cornerstone American political principle in fidelity to the founding era thinkers themselves and in continuation of 2 centuries of African American political thought. King correctly reminded his 20th century audience, and he reminds us in the 21st century, that the American experiment is about freedom. This is an important point, especially as partisan rhetoric surrounding other political principles, such as equality or justice, proliferates. Freedom lies at the core of these other political ideas and has historically served as a unifying touchstone for Americans who are otherwise divided on what equality or justice should mean in practice. Of course, freedom itself as a concept has occasionally been co-opted or used for various purposes, but more often it has served as that unifying touchstone in American political history. Secondly, King advanced our understanding of freedom by explaining its spiritual, immaterial, or metaphysical character. This was a major contribution to the American political tradition. In the Revolutionary era, as in the thought of John Locke, freedom did have an intrinsically and distinctly spiritual dimension. We see this both in religious articulations of the principle of freedom at this time, as in statements of what was termed the liberty of a Christian, and also in John Locke's secular explanation of freedom in terms of the ownership of one's person through self-consciousness. But in the American Revolution, assertions of freedom became very concrete. The practical dispute centered on taxation, something very practical and concrete. The Sons of Liberty dumped tea into the Boston Harbor. And of course, an incredibly violent conflict erupted and continued for nearly a decade. The profoundly metaphysical nature of freedom was obscured by the intensely physical nature of the attempt to secure it. A similar thing occurred in the case of the fight against enslavement. Enslaved African Americans exercised various forms of spiritual resistance and asserted their metaphysical freedom in myriad ways, despite the circumstances of enslavement. One of the clearest and most beautiful examples of this was through the Negro spirituals, or the sorrow songs, as W.E.B. Du Bois called them. Resistance to enslavement was, however, also a necessarily physical undertaking. Nat Turner's revolt and John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry were just a couple of examples of this. The Civil War itself is another. Frederick Douglass's quotation from Lord Byron sums up this point nicely. Who would be free themselves must strike the blow. In the case of the institution of slavery, physical assertions of freedom through violent resistance and conflict were necessary as a kind of prelude to or prerequisite for the exercise of further freedom. What King's philosophy of freedom through nonviolent resistance did then was to bring about a restoration of the metaphysical dimension of human freedom that had always lain at the core of the American political tradition, but that had been tragically obscured by circumstances that necessitated physical confrontation and violence. In this way, we can see King as not only an echo of American founding principles, but also as an inspiration for continuing to reapply these principles in our own and future times in an ever more pure and fundamentally human way. With that, I'll conclude, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Seagrave. I have a ton of questions spinning around in my head, but I wanted to give our students or guests an opportunity first. Or if your ideas are percolating, I'll be happy to start things off. So you mentioned the focus on equality versus the focus on liberty. And in American Studies 100, we read the Birmingham jail address. In my 200, we read I Have a Dream, which the creed focuses on equality, right? But then ends with free at last. And Tocqueville talks about this difficult balancing act between liberty and equality. And it seems to me your talk is saying that fundamentally liberty, for lack of better words, comes first. So I'm wondering if you could shed some light on the relationship between equality and liberty their inseparability or if you see them as separable. And if it's useful to you, maybe talk about how you and your co-author have danced around these topics.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question. Yeah, so I don't want to give the impression in talking about freedom that I'm in any way disparaging the concept of equality. I think the concept of equality is very important. But yeah, my point rather is just to try to explain how the two relate to each other, as you said, freedom and equality. In Tocqueville's thought, in Tocqueville's writing, equality, of course, can be a dangerous thing, right? Or it can have sort of dangerous practical dimensions if it's imposed in a way that inhibits freedom, right? Or if it prevents freedom from being exercised, which of course can happen politically. So Tocqueville is worried about equality, but so I'm more concerned with just trying to understand how the two relate to each other and to point out that equality, in a sense, it's an empty concept, right? Because it's a relation, it's an expression of relation. So what's really important is what's equal, right? If you were to order a drink and say you want a drink with equal parts, the bartender's not going to know what to give you, right? Because equal parts of what? Equality it needs to be filled in. And so I think in the founding era it was filled in primarily with freedom, right? It was equal freedom. So that's kind of what I want to point out so that we can understand and appreciate what equality means, right? And what we're actually working towards when we work towards equality. That's the core of that concept. And I'd say, in terms of the connection with my co-author and the book that we wrote together. That was one thing that ended up being, as we wrote the book, we discovered that was a major theme that our distinct disciplines had in common. So my co-author is an ethnomusicologist, so she studies the history of music and culture in the United States. And the end of our book, the last chapter, is about freedom because she points out the importance of freedom in the history of music of the African diaspora, particularly African American music, and how important that concept is as an inspiration for that music. And she connects it to W.E.B. Du Bois, who also I didn't focus on him, but he is a major proponent and philosopher of freedom. And so Du Bois forms actually a kind of connecting point between the musical analysis in the book and the political analysis that I give. So we found that freedom also crossed over to being a fundamental concept for musical elaborations on this theme. So so that really jumped out at us in teaching the course, Race in the American Story, and then in working on the book. And so it's something that recently, as I've gone back to the founding and looked at this, as I mentioned, kind of looking at what were the founders writing about and thinking about, looking at sermons of the time and newspaper articles and letters, I was surprised by the predominance of freedom relative to equality. And so that led me to try to think through, well, how do these two relate to each other? I think they saw them often as synonymous in some form and as interconnected, right? Equality and freedom. I think we see it the same way. But I think it's important to understand what we mean, when we're talking about equality and how it's connected to freedom.
Thank you.
My question goes to the speech that really wasn't. Am I integrating my people into a burning house? Do you believe that King had evolved his idea of freedom to include autonomy over one's own economic circumstance? And what can you say to that?
Yes. So that's a very important part of the story as well in understanding King. So I think so. Obviously, in his later, in the last few years of his life, especially, King turned to focus more on the economic dimensions of freedom and equality, and focusing on the situations of people in poverty, and not only in the United States but also around the world, and he did connect that also to freedom. And so I think that that there's a clear connection to be made there in autonomy, right? Control over one's path in life is largely dependent on control over one's economic wherewithal and circumstances, and being sufficiently equal economically to others in your society, and having just the ability to be independent economically, right? I think that's the crucial connection there. So yeah, King saw, particularly later in his life, that he couldn't avoid speaking about economics, and that the economic system of the United States, and this is of course connected to how it developed historically, through and with the institution of slavery, and then in the years following the abolition of slavery and Reconstruction era, that the freedom for African Americans was intrinsically tied to economic circumstances and economic autonomy and well-being. So yeah, I think that's a very important part of the story as well. And there are connections. I mean, obviously, this is also a close connection with the American political tradition, thinking about freedom in connection to property, and the Revolutionary era, the slogan, "No taxation without representation." Economic freedom is intimately intertwined with political freedom and with personal autonomy. So yeah, so I think King saw that very clearly, and spoke about that in those later speeches. Yeah, follow
Follow-up? And this also has to do with economic freedom. What do you think King would feel today as we're watching the rollback of many of the efforts which he had, that are intimately connected to freedoms? We're seeing them vanish today.
Yeah, so I might need to ask a clarifying question there. So the rollback specifically. So I can think of a few dimensions in which this is happening. So do you want to specify what?
Well, they're happening on so many fronts and so rapidly today.
Yes,
it seems like every morning there's a new incursion on some civil right, and these executive orders that we're seeing.
Yep. Okay, I see. Yeah. So what would King think about that? Yeah, and this is one of those, again, one of these depressing historical what ifs, as you mentioned with Oscar Dunn. What if King had lived longer? I mean, assassinated at 39. I mean, it's incredible to think about what impact he could have had if he hadn't been assassinated so young, right? So what would he think about developments since? I mean, I think he would be saddened and disappointed by many things that have happened. I think that the progress, and this is always the way it works in American history, it seems, where important moments of progress are often followed by more significant backsliding or steps in the other direction, reactions, I think. So I think he'd be disappointed by that in many ways. There are obviously ways in which we continue to progress along the lines that King had hoped in interpersonal relations at times in certain parts of the country and certain moments among certain people. I think that King's dream has continued to have an impact and to influence the way people think and interact with each other. So I don't think it's an entirely negative story that he would see some good that has come since. But I think in terms of political developments, economic developments, I think he would be still in the protester camp. I think that's where he would be. Yeah.
Perhaps a quick follow-up in maybe a more broad abstract. You started your discussion with the concept of non-interventionist liberty, freedom from. And so I think the last question gets into this broader concept of to what extent has American political development moved in the direction of interventionist liberty or positive actions being necessary for one to enjoy their liberty?
Yeah. So this idea of positive rights, or the need to have help from another entity, other people, the government, something in order to exercise your rights. So I guess, is your question to what extent, what would King think about that, or to what extent?
However you'd like to address it, whatever's most comfortable for you. Whether his thought maybe embraces that, because I think that's a debate sort of going on today in terms of how interventionist government needs to be for basic levels of liberty.
Yeah. So, I think that it's true that in our, so the way our economy has developed, the way society has developed, that there are certainly ways in which intervention is needed to ensure freedom and government policy intervention. And actually, I think that the history of racism in the United States and the history of slavery were in many ways responsible for creating the need for government intervention to ensure freedom, and that was an important precedent in our political history, that government has to be empowered to bring about freedom for individuals. That was absolutely needed in the case of slavery, right? It was not going to end without radical government intervention. And then, as we saw at the failures of Reconstruction, as soon as government intervention goes away, racism and inequality and Jim Crow pops up. And so I think the federal government has needed to intervene in the case of issues of race in American history, and it's just to establish basic justice and freedom for African Americans. And I think that has that led to the growth of the government in many ways, which of course then was given new life in the New Deal and after the Great Depression, the need for government to intervene economically in that way. So I think it's been a circumstantial but in some ways inevitable development over the course of American history that government intervention has been needed as a matter of fact to ensure greater freedom for individuals. So I think that, and I think that's right in some cases. But I do think that King reminds us that that's a dangerous trend. It's a dangerous thing to assume that our personal human freedom is dependent upon the government or is dependent upon other people in society. I think he would remind us that we have to take those interventions as baseline prerequisites for us exercising our own freedom and autonomy. And I think that's tough to do. And I think culturally it's tough to bend things back in that direction. So I think that's part of why it's important to go back and remember the way King spoke about freedom, is that he reminds us that this is what freedom is, and that even if intervention is needed to help with material conditions, that we shouldn't confuse that with our actual freedom, right? Yeah.
To what extent is that view connected to his religious framework?
Yeah, so I think for King, I mean, it's all very closely connected with his religious beliefs. Starting off obviously as a preacher, as a Christian pastor, minister, I think he sees everything in terms through that lens to some degree, and I think that reinforces the idea that freedom is a spiritual thing, right? And spiritual, of course, can mean religious, or it can mean just not physical and material. And so I think for King it was both. So I think that is just intertwined with everything he writes and thinks about, is that religious dimension. But that said, I do think that a lot of what he says about freedom is separable from Christianity, right? So I don't think one has to be a Christian or even a religious person to understand what King says about freedom. And part of the evidence for that is that Gandhi, of course, had some very similar ideas at times about freedom and love, and coming from a very different religious tradition. So I think it's separable, but I think for King himself, he saw it through that lens. Yeah.
Thanks for this. I want to make a case that in 2025, there's a version of the equality argument has more traction than the freedom argument, and then see what you think about it. So that in King's time, his connection of freedom to a natural law, natural rights tradition, it has a coherence with lots of other people at the time. It's not clear to me that 62 years on, we have an ongoing tradition that can appeal to natural law rights on a sort of large population basis, whereas since then we have had a grounding of a kind of equality of opportunity, equal protection under the law through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and other sorts of statutory efforts that grounded in a positive law argument. And my intuition, or maybe my partial argument here, is that in 2025, when you're talking about rhetoric to voters, a positive law argument that traces its history to the Civil Rights Act and then to the 14th Amendment is going to have more traction than a freedom natural law argument that faces increasing fraction about its source.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good point. And I certainly agree with you to a large extent. I think that's right that the way King thought about freedom and connections to the natural law tradition and of course even Christian religious tradition, that doesn't have the same traction today in 2025 as it did at his time. I think that's absolutely right. And certainly that was part of the reason why he put it that way, right? It resonated with his audience. I don't think it was just rhetorical the way he put that, but that was part of it. So you're right. I mean, so what's the relevance? I mean, I think so equality certainly does. I mean, it has that political traction, and I think it is useful and good to argue for certain things in terms of equality, in terms of public policy today. I think it's more, and I wouldn't advocate, legislators and people campaigning to start talking about classic natural law and citing Socrates and St. Thomas Aquinas. It's just not going to go over well, and voters won't know what they're talking about. And even in terms of freedom, and freedoms, I mean, the way King elaborated the concept of freedom is really complex. I mean, you can't package that for political purposes very easily today. I think that's right. So I think that it's more in. I mean, what are we doing in schools? What are we doing when we teach about American history and American political principles, about the Declaration of Independence, for example? What are we teaching students? How are we talking about it in the culture? I think that's where we can see some change. And I think, for example, natural law concepts, it is still a very narrow academic sort of field that's concerned with ideas of natural law philosophy. But there are also touch points where that has become influential in public policy and in the courts, for example. Particularly, we see that. So I think there are ways in which through education and through political culture, that we can ensure that freedom continues to be understood properly and in this connection to equality. So I think that's more where some of that influence can continue to be important. But I think you make a good point. Yeah.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot. Is there another question?
Yeah, I think. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Besides yourself, after King's time, are there other metaphysical thinkers who share this thought, who have kind of carried on King's legacy and original intention?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so since King's time, obviously there are, academic philosophy continues to talk about this in various ways, but not in a way that touches political culture. I don't think very closely. I think we see it in religious traditions. I think that's probably where it continues to live on most noticeably, for obvious reasons, because people in religious traditions or who have faith in God and in spiritual realities, I think that it continues to live on there. In terms of secular culture, they're honestly, I think beyond academic philosophy, it is hard for me to think offhand about ways in which King's metaphysical idea of freedom has continued to be influential. So no, I think it's difficult. I think we've become more materialistic probably rather than less since King's time. And that is something probably that again, to Brian's question, that King wouldn't be too happy about, probably the way our economy has continued to develop in our culture. So that's, yeah, my view is that it's probably become less influential culturally rather than more so. Yeah.
Okay, as I was saying a moment ago, I think this has given us a lot to think about as we come up on our 250th anniversary of the Declaration, and I think the discussion of MLK's thought and relation with the Declaration of Independence will certainly be part of that celebration. So I'm very grateful to you for your talk, and please join me in thanking Dr. Seagrave.